Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 21, Section 4, Pushing Back the Axis. And as we go along, we're going to talk a little bit about the U.S. involvement in the war on both fronts. If you want to take a look at the European theater and the Pacific theater as being two different fronts. Uh, the United States, when we declare war on Japan, it's within a couple of days that Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States, opening up a two-front war for us. But what's interesting is we saw Germany as a greater threat. And so this is where we're going to actually probably spend more time putting manpower towards helping our allies, helping Great Britain, eventually helping the Soviets. But we really get involved in this starting with the Allied invasion of North Africa in November of 1942. And one of the things that you're going to notice is the dates here. We actually land troops off the coast or on the coast of Morocco in November of 1942. And eventually we're going to land more troops basically in parts of Algeria in the weeks to come. What's interesting is when you look at um, literally the first few weeks of this invasion, the United States really didn't encounter a lot of resistance here. It's when we start pushing towards the country of Tunisia in the beginning of 1943 do we really start seeing kind of the heat of warfare. And a lot of our troops are actually going to get their first taste of how dangerous it has been, at least for the British. Um, we were helping the British push the German troops under Rommel towards Tunisia. And what ends up happening is we get to the beginnings of May. Rommel, for the most part, he leaves North Africa. He's got some other issues happening. If you read a little bit about his biography, he had some health issues, and certainly there were some concerns about him. And so he leaves. His troops quickly leave as well, and they end up going to Sicily. And eventually, this is going to be kind of the course of the war. We're going to go from Sicily on up into the boot heel of Italy and kind of push our way up that peninsula to about the time of the D-Day invasion. Okay, so among the agreements reached at the Casablanca conference was a decision to set up the bombing of Germany. The Casablanca conference happens in January of 1943, shortly after the United States invades parts of Morocco. And it's a meeting of Churchill and FDR. And what they decide is that the United States is going to help Great Britain in some bombing campaigns. Great Britain has been bombing Germany kind of by themselves. And what they want to do is set up a situation where the Allies are constantly bombing Germany to kind of rough them up a little bit. Great Britain is going to bomb at night, and the United States primarily is going to be bombing during the daylight hours. This puts a lot of American pilots at risk because when you're bombing it in the daylight, it's a lot easier to see your enemy, and hence, that's very risky. And even though the risks were there, this campaign was very successful in the sense that we were able to start crippling Germany's production of war materials. And this is going to soften Germany up to being, able to be defeated in the long run. The bombing campaign between January 43 and May of 1945 caused severe oil shortages for the Germans, and it wrecked their railroad system, which is absolutely needed to kind of soften the German juggernaut. And it worked by all means. The Italian campaign, where our allies were kind of moving through Sicily and up the Boot Hill, was one of the bloodiest campaigns in the war. It's one that kind of gets overseen because of the fact that we put a lot more emphasis on the D-Day invasion and such, but it cost more than 300,000 Allied casualties. I mentioned a while back the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Group, made up of former Japanese American internees. This is where they did a lot of their fighting, and this is where they kind of came out as being very gallant soldiers. So certainly a very tough campaign. It's one that probably should get more recognition than it does in our history books. Our Allied leaders got together again at the Tehran Conference. This was being held in Tehran, Iran. Um, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, they promised to launch a full-scale offensive against the Germans when the Allies invaded France in 1944. Basically, Stalin was like, come on, Churchill, come on, Roosevelt, I need your help so we can, pull the Germans out of the Soviet Union. We need you to launch a big campaign. And this is when we start making those plans, is at this conference. Just so you know, Churchill and FDR, they were a little skeptical of Stalin. They knew that there were a lot of spies from the Soviet Union kind of watching their communication, and certainly there was an issue of trust here. But they did do those kind of things. Stalin also promised that once Germany was defeated, that the Soviet Union would help the United States defeat Japan. What's interesting is if you look at the timeline of these events, Stalin really doesn't get involved in the war in Japan until literally the last moment of the war, right about the time that we have the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. Does he declare war on Japan? So a lot of people get kind of upset with Stalin for his lack of, living up to his promise here. President Roosevelt chose General Dwight D. Eisenhower to command the Allied invasion known as Operation Overlord, or probably what most of you remember is the D-Day invasion. Eisenhower had been involved in the invasion of North Africa, basically came off as kind of a cool-headed leader. There was some talk that maybe General Patton would be the one, leading up this invasion, but Patton had kind of a hot temper, and I think those higher ups in Washington didn't want to have him at the helm when this invasion was going to happen. And so Eisenhower was the man that they kind of relied upon. And that probably was for the best. Germany believed that the Allies would basically land in a place called Place de Calais, which is actually on this map up here, this area very close to Dunkirk and kind of across the narrowest point of the English Channel. And we set up kind of a dummy army. I think you guys might remember in world history, we talked about the inflatable decoys that we used to kind of fool the German army. We set those up in places very close to Place de Calais. And instead, we planned the invasion at the beaches of Normandy. Not only were U.S. troops going to be coming ashore that day, but British and Canadian troops would be as well. The two landing areas that the Americans got were Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, and that's where a lot of the heaviest of action was taking place on that day. But on the day of D-Day, June 6, 1944, nearly 7,000 ships carrying more than 100,000 soldiers set sail for the coast of Normandy. Along with that, we had paratroopers that came in overnight to kind of secure areas along the beachhead and such. Within literally the end of June of 1944, we had roughly 1 million Allied soldiers that had crossed the Channel into France, kind of setting up the largest invasion force that we're ever going to see in human history. So American troops came under intense German fire and suffered heavy losses after their landing on Omaha Beach. Again, one of the, kind of the goriest part of the D-Day invasion came at that spot. Movies like Saving Private Ryan probably do a really good job of depicting what happened that day, but certainly these individuals that were storming those beaches came under a lot of fire and certainly had to face a lot of real trying times trying to claim that beachhead. So while building up for invading France was taking place in Britain, American military leaders was also defeating a strategy to defeat Japan. And the first part of the American two-prong attack on Japan called for the Pacific Fleet to hop from island to island. This is sometimes known as island hopping, okay, or leapfrogging, if you want to call it that. The idea is that the Japanese were um, basically had troops on a lot of the small islands out in the Pacific, and rather than trying to storm every single island, what the military wanted to do is to find the strategic points, the most important islands to take. And obviously, there are some islands that are probably a little bit more strategic than others. When we talk about the Solomon Islands and when we talk about New Guinea and the Philippines and such, Marshall, Guam, um, those are areas that we definitely need to make sure that we have control of. Just so you know, there were actually Japanese troops on some of the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and yeah, that we had fights that were happening in that part of the Americas, at least in our territories at that period of time. But we were looking at getting closer to Japan and taking some of the islands that might be helpful as far as doing some bombing campaigns in the future. And so, islands like Tenaman and eventually Iwo Jima became very important to the military because of the fact that you could basically create landing strips there for the Army Air Corps and for the Navy. That it could also be used for refueling aircraft and such in those bombing campaigns. So that's the kind of stuff that we were looking for as far as military targets. The geographical problem with the Central Pacific was that many of the islands were coral reef atolls. For example, the island of Midway is really an atoll. If you know what an atoll is, that's kind of like you know, when you talk about shallow waters that have that organic material that's kind of, coming up from the bottom, or in some cases, the rims of volcanoes that have formed under the sea that eventually are cresting at surface level. That's the kind of stuff that we were dealing with, and certainly doesn't necessarily make it ideal as far as the terrain is concerned. American military planners wanted to use the Mariana Islands as a base for a new heavy bombing group that could reach Japan. And eventually, we start targeting that area as far as attacking the Japanese in that area. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is in the Philippines, was the first time that the Japanese officially used kamikaze attacks. Not to say that that didn't happen before, but kamikaze is basically a pilot that is kind of inexperienced. A lot of times they're younger pilots that haven't had a lot of training, and they're flying basically a suicide bombing raid. The idea is that the planes that they're flying are basically loaded with fuel and explosives, so they're kind of like a smart bomb. It's probably the best way to explain it. And so these kamikazes were primarily targeting American ships. For example, the battleship, the USS Missouri, was one of those ships that was targeted by kamikazes. Some of these attacks were very successful, especially when we talk about like the carriers. If they're aircraft that are sitting near the deck, or if there's a large supply of aviation fuel, certainly if you hit in the right strategic point, you can do a lot of damage. But sometimes on the battleships, these kamikazes, they did some damage. They didn't necessarily paralyze or sink the vessels. A lot of it is all a matter of where the kamikaze actually hits. And in some cases, maybe they do maybe a better job of actually hitting in a lethal kind of way than others. All right. Thank you very much.